Well, the war against Russia in Ukraine has been lost. It has been lost for months. I think they should understand that there was a deliberate coup. Americans working closely with the Central Intelligence Agency, people like Newland and others, systematically installed a new government composed of people that would do business with us.
Welcome to a new episode, Deep Dive. Joining me today is Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Colonel Macgregor, it's an honor having you on the show. It's the first time, it's a premiere that you're on a German channel, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your invitation.
You're very welcome. Before we start off with the interview, let me briefly introduce you to my audience. You are a retired United States Army officer, military strategist, and author, of course. And you also started a YouTube channel, and I will put the link in the show notes, of course, and you definitely have to check it out. You served in the US Army for over 28 years. You're also the author of several books, for example, Transformation Under Fire. Colonel Macgregor, it's a pleasure having you on my show. And like I already mentioned, it's a premiere on a German channel, but you already have been to Germany a couple of years ago. Would you tell us where you have been?
Well, let's see. My first trip to Germany, interestingly enough, came in 1968 when I was only 15. And I ended up spending time in Prague, Budapest, Vienna, Munich, Nuremberg, Berlin. And so I decided after all of that I would compete to become an exchange student. And I returned in 69, August of 1969, and studied in Braunschweig, for a year. At least I say I studied. I'm not sure I studied very hard. I was busy learning German and probably enjoying myself too much.
Okay. So, and which one was more successful, enjoyment or learning German?
Well, I think I've survived both experiences, but then I subsequently went back in '74 and spent a few weeks at the Heeresoffizierschule I in Hanover, and then I returned twice as a serving Army officer. This was '77 until '80, and then subsequently '89 until I think '92. And of course, in the middle of that, I went to the Gulf with the same unit that I was serving with in Germany.
All right. Okay. And so we could do this interview also in German?
Tja, das ist eine gefährliche Angelegenheit für mich, denn mir fehlt die Genauigkeit. Ne? Ich weiß nicht, wie ich immer auf Deutsch reagieren soll. Also ich möchte diese Gefahr nicht eingehen, so I'm going to speak English instead.
Okay, next time, but it's amazing. It's better than my English, so chapeau. Okay.
No, your English is excellent.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. You're charming. It's very charming, flattering. Let's talk about the situation in Ukraine right now. Since the war between Israel and the Hamas started, the war in Ukraine is not that popular anymore and lost some attention. So what's the situation right now in Ukraine? And could you give us a quick overview what your take is on the war in the Ukraine?
Well, the war against Russia in Ukraine has been lost. It has been lost for months. And the Ukrainians have simply run out of manpower. They've exhausted most of their human resources, and they've got a lot of equipment that's left, but they don't have all of the ammunition they need. They're suffering from an old malady, and that is the misguided assumption that you can build a military establishment on the fly. In other words, within a few months, the space of a few years, you can build a brand new military establishment. It simply isn't possible. And right now, the Russians are capturing men that are age 70 and over, as well as boys age 15, 14, 13. And women are beginning to show up, and they too are being killed on the battlefield. There's a very large battle occurring as we speak in Avdiivka, in the central part of eastern Ukraine. There are several thousand Ukrainian troops there fighting. These are probably what I would call almost the last truly battle-worthy forces that the Ukrainians have. And the Russians are fighting them. And the defenses there were built over several years, so they're not easily cracked. And the Russians have taken losses. But there are also talks underway between the Russian military command and the Ukrainian military command about the wisdom of essentially ending the fighting and surrendering. Whether or not that will happen, I don't know. I frankly hope it will, because this is a lost cause. It should never have happened. This war was always avoidable. And I remember when I served in Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe in Mons, Belgium, that one of the things that we concluded was that NATO, since it no longer had a permanent enemy, so to say, in the form of Russia, and Russia certainly, in my judgment, is not the enemy today either, that NATO really existed to prevent another war in Europe from breaking out. We felt that that was a good reason to keep NATO. But of course, we have been diverted from that path, first in Bosnia, then subsequently in Kosovo, and ultimately now, sadly, in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a pity, definitely. Mentioning that we could have stopped the war a long time ago. Most recently, there has been an interview with the chief negotiator of Zelensky, and he publicly admitted that a peace deal has been on the table back in March of 2022 already. So we could have saved 100,000 of lives on both sides, actually, and billions of dollars. But this peace deal was prevented by Boris Johnson. And according to the chief negotiator, he actually said, let's make war. Is the West responsible for the war and all the people that have died since then? What's your opinion on that?
Oh, absolutely. We're responsible for the conflict long before Boris Johnson showed up. Keep in mind that Johnson was simply a messenger boy for Biden in Washington. Washington has been driving towards this confrontation for a long time. And we have to admit that Mr. Putin has been very clear over the last 10 to 15 years about what his country would and would not accept in Ukraine. And he made it abundantly clear that they would not accept a large NATO, specifically U.S. military presence in eastern Ukraine. And the fear was always that we would position missiles beyond the Dnieper River that could reach critical targets inside Russia within minutes and effectively even neutralize their own nuclear deterrent, as well as their early warning system. All of this was unacceptable. And we pressed ahead in any case. We can go all the way back to 1992 and the promises that were made at that time that we would not advance the border of NATO further east. But those promises went by the wayside. The Russians put up with it, but Ukraine was the last straw. They would not accept that. And that's shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone. It's essentially analogous to the Soviets putting missiles into Cuba back in the 1960s. We found that intolerable. So the sad part is it was never necessary. We could have avoided all of this. And then we, of course, backed this coup, which brought in a government that would effectively be hostile. And the thing that's interesting about that is I'm sure your viewers realize that when Mr. Zelensky was handpicked to be the candidate for president by Mr. Kolomoisky, the oligarch with billions at his disposal, who I suppose is now sitting in jail somewhere awaiting trial, Zelensky ran on a peace platform. Zelensky said, if you elect me, I will go to Moscow. I will talk to the Russians. We will settle this. He won overwhelmingly, with the exception of the very, very far west around Lvov, or what used to be called Lemberg. And other than the Ukrainians in that area, everyone voted for him, not because they liked him or thought he was brilliant or anything else, but because they did not want to go to war with Russia. So the notion that somehow or another this was inevitable, that the Ukrainians are implacable enemies of the Russians, that the hatred is old and can never be changed, that's just not true. But once committed, of course, the Ukrainians are very stubborn people, and they're very patriotic, and they've died in great numbers. I think they've lost now very close to, if not beyond, 500,000 dead on the battlefields. And I don't know how many others have been wounded, seriously wounded, to the point where they'll never lead normal lives. They've never had on the Ukrainian side an effective and professional medical evacuation system. And when you do that, you're putting all of your soldiers at serious risk. It should never have happened. And of course, the biggest problem is that when Zelensky met with Johnson, he also heard the promise that came from Washington, which was, you need to stick with this, fight this war. We will back you until you win. The Russians cannot win. You will have the entire scientific industrial might and power of the United States and NATO behind you. We will stay with you to the end. Well, that's all nonsense. It never made any sense. It was wrong. And all of the assumptions that we embraced about Russia were fundamentally false. That Russia is weak. Russia has a military that's too small. Well, truthfully, at the beginning of this operation, the ground force was too small. And of course, that then raises the question of, if it was too small for eastern Ukraine at the beginning, what makes anyone think that the Russians were planning on attacking Eastern Europe and marching into Warsaw? That's a lot of nonsense. It was never on anybody's mind in Moscow. So that had to change. And what we've done is effectively created the very thing we said we went in to stop. You now have a Russian military establishment that is probably more powerful today than it has been since the 1980s. In addition to that, I think it's probably the best military establishment they've had in 40 or 50 years. It's very competent. It's well officered, well led. It's now very well equipped. And this is probably the thing that people seem to miss. We said they were too weak, that they would be isolated economically, that we could, as we have done historically, use the American-dominated global financial system to punish Russia. It didn't work. And more we're watching as nations have simply decided to no longer do business in dollars, to walk away from the SWIFT system. Everyone has decided we're tired of being bullied by the United States financially. This is not a good thing for the United States, but then again, we've behaved very badly. And hubris or arrogance die slow deaths.
True. So, but weren't you surprised at the beginning how bad managed the Russian army was, or how long it took for them to reorganize, or that they failed with the Battle of Kiev and so on?
No, actually speaking, I'm shocked that they turned it all around as quickly as they did.
Okay.
I never saw any evidence for a desire to move into Kiev. I think that there was some contemplation about it, but it was unserious. There were no serious plans, nor was the force really in a position to do that. And then, of course, once the negotiations started, the Russians immediately withdrew because they thought the negotiations would bear fruit. If you go back and look at what was done at the time, the Russians said, fine, we'll go to a ceasefire right now, freeze in place. And their demands were, in my judgment, quite reasonable. They said, recognize Crimea, stop the nonsense. That was never part of Ukraine, by the way. Anybody who knows European history knows that. And then Luhansk and Donetsk, the so-called breakaway provinces, are Russian. And what Putin and his colleagues really wanted was equal rights before the law in Ukraine for Russians. Not, in my judgment, an outrageous demand. And then finally, they wanted neutrality. I mean, that's, again, eminently reasonable. And those of us that have looked at Austria or Finland before the Finns recently lost their minds, it has worked very, very well. And there was no reason why Ukraine had to become a military showdown between the United States, its allies, and Russia. None whatsoever. And historically, we have no strategic interest in Ukraine, let alone Eastern Ukraine.
So what do you think, how many soldiers died on the Russian side? Because you already mentioned 500,000 on the Ukrainian side, but how many Russians?
I think roughly 500,000 dead is a reasonable number for the Ukrainians. For the Russians, I've heard different estimates. I had better sources for what was happening in Ukraine because of connections I have in Poland, the Czech Republic, Ukraine, and some Russian, but mostly Ukrainian. I grew up with Ukrainians in Philadelphia, in the United States. I like them. I am not an anti-Ukrainian person by any means, but I thought the Ukrainian government was negligent, corrupt, and borderline criminal. And I saw no reason for a war with Russia. So I had to make a decision, and so I supported what I thought was the right answer for Europe and for Ukraine, which was an end to the war with Russia as soon as possible. Obviously, I failed, and everybody else who tried to bring that to an end failed. But we did not know that former Chancellor Merkel and some of her colleagues, were actively working to bring on the fight. Had no idea. I looked at the Minsk Accords, and again, I thought they were not unreasonable. They were workable. I had no idea that it was an empty facade. So it's bad enough to know just how corrupt and incompetent Washington can be, but I had hoped for something better from Berlin.
Yeah, I have to disappoint you. So, talking about corruption and Zelensky, a few weeks ago, there was an article in the Time magazine where close advisors of Zelensky admitted that he has become, quote, crazy, and that high military leaders don't execute his commands. Do you think that the elites are done with Ukraine in the US and perhaps even in Europe? And you think Zelensky is out of his mind, as mentioned in this Time magazine article?
Well, first of all, let's step back for a moment and consider how America handles these kinds of problems historically. I always ask Europeans the same question. What did we do in Vietnam when the war effectively ended? And they all look at me strangely and I say, we left. We left. Now, what does that mean? Things didn't go our way. We failed miserably. So we tried to put up a facade and say that we had been as successful as we could, and then we quietly stopped funding everything and we walked away. What the Germans have never understood is that we, Americans, like the British, are preeminently a maritime and aerospace power. We are not a land power in Eurasia. We are only a continental military power in the sense of ground forces in the Western Hemisphere. And when you have this background and historical experience, you learn that when things don't go your way, you can pack your bags and simply leave. And then the aftermath is everyone else's problem. And what happens inside the United States, where most Americans on any given day could care less what happens beyond their borders, is the media changes the subject. They don't talk about it anymore. I mean, what I thought was interesting is I would read these bulletins that would come out of the Pentagon, something called the Early Bird. And a friend of mine called me and said, have you seen today's Early Bird? I said, no, this is months ago. He said, no one's talking about Ukraine. Now they're talking about alleged aggressive moves by China in the South China Sea, which of course is nonsense. But that was a clear signal that we had effectively abandoned the effort in Ukraine. Charles de Gaulle got it right. Charles de Gaulle said in a speech, Europeans need to understand two things. Great Britain is an island, and Americans do not live in Europe. And I've often gotten into arguments with my German colleagues because I said, stop acting as though you have to apologize for 13 years of history. Germany is a great power. It has a role to play in Europe, an important role. You need to play it and stop being foolish and paying for this crime of 13 years. And it wasn't even 13 years. It was during the war itself. And by the way, nobody ever points out that Adolf Hitler couldn't have done anything without the active help and assistance and support of Stalin and the Soviet Union. You couldn't have gotten a single German tank fully fueled on its way into France or anywhere else without Soviet fuel, Soviet oil, Soviet gas, scarce minerals, rare earths, everything that you needed for the military machine, all came out of the Soviet Union. No one ever brings that up. And so we give the Soviet a pass. The Soviet Union was a victim. Nonsense. The Soviet Union did everything it could to bankroll Hitler in the hopes that Western Europe would fight itself to a standstill. But nobody brings these things up. So let's stop all the nonsense about the Second World War. And I'm not interested in punishing Russia today for what the Soviets did either. The Russians have an important role to play in Europe. We should have turned to them early on and said, yes, you have an important role to play in Europe, just as Germany does, and embraced them and said, let's work together. We did the opposite. So this is a terrible set of circumstances now, and the Europeans are left holding the bag. And Putin today spoke, just before I came on, I read the text, and he said he has no intention of talking to anyone in Washington until after the next election. Well, why would he? All we've done is lie to the man about everything. And then we poured nothing but buckets of filth and abuse all over Putin and the Moscow government as though it were effectively Stalin, which it isn't. Not at all. So, I think the Europeans now have to get involved and take a hand. You've got to find someone in Germany with the ability, the brains, the character, the courage to be chancellor. I don't have an answer for you, but you need one badly. And Germany can play a role in bringing this absolute monstrous catastrophe to an end because no one else is going to do it. Washington's not going to do it. Washington has shifted attention entirely to Israel now in the Middle East. And as some of my friends point out, having made a terrible mess of Europe, now we're going to finish off the rest of the Middle East with more stupidity. I hope not. But, I don't have much hope these days for the people we have in power. And unlike you, we don't have a parliamentary system. So for the moment, we're stuck. You are not.
We are too. We have the worst government in history, actually. In the last 70 years, it's a nightmare. But what do you think? How will it end? You think, when will the war end? What's your scenario for the future? What do you think? How will this whole mess end?
Well, I think the Russians, who never had any interest in controlling Eastern Europe, are going to sit down and decide what they think the minimal requirements are for their long-term national security. I think the Russians will want to control those areas that are inhabited primarily by Russians. That means you move from Kharkov, which is historically a Russian-speaking city, all the way down to Odessa. Now, where the line is drawn across eastern Ukraine, whether they go to Zaporozhye and then from Zaporozhye over further east, I have no idea. And I think that's what, and they'll want neutrality for whatever survives of Ukraine. But again, people have said, well, what about Poland? Does Poland have a role to play? I would tell you, frankly, that if the Poles were not in NATO, and unfortunately for Russia, they are, I don't think the Russians would care who controlled Western Ukraine. They just don't want a hostile party there. The problem for Warsaw is it's demonstrated that it too is incurably hostile. Now that could change, but for the moment, that's the situation. So I think the Russians will determine these are our minimal requirements. And then I think they'll look for partners in Europe. And the only partner historically that the Russians have ever been able to look to with any reliability is Berlin.
Not anymore, with all the sanctions and Nord Stream. So
the Russians did not blow up Nord Stream.
That's the next question, actually. What do you think? Who was it?
Well, first of all, I don't have access right now because I'm on the outside of the administration. Even though I have a top secret clearance, I don't have access to precise information. But I think it's pretty clear that we had a hand in it. Because you have all the senior political figures from Victoria Nuland, the architect of catastrophe in Ukraine, as well as President Biden himself, all saying, if this war breaks out, we will stop it. There will be no transit of liquefied natural gas or oil or anything else from Russia into Germany. And when I was working for President Trump, I actually wrote a short memo because I was trying to convince people that Russia is not the Soviet Union, and good business between Germany and Russia is not evil, and we should not view it negatively. Of course, he was voted out of office and never had a chance to really act on any of it, but he was replaced by people who were just, in my judgment, out of touch with reality and determined to bring on a war. They succeeded. Now it's being lost by all of the people that we supported. So the question is, what will the Russians do? I think they will exercise patience. They'll try to bring an end to this. They'll try to have a Ukrainian partner to talk to. There may be some Ukrainian military leaders who are willing to sit down with them to put an end to this travesty. I don't know. But again, I think they would like some European partners. And originally, when I was recommending neutrality for Ukraine, and this is back in 2014, I said, you've got to have a conference and you've got to have the leadership of all the states that border Russia: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, Romania. Everyone needs to sign up for this neutrality. And then you need, as a minimum, preferably Berlin and Paris to sign on for it. but nothing ever happened. But that again, something like that has to happen eventually to put an end to this travesty in Eastern Europe.
You mentioned that Victoria Nuland, who also said "fuck the EU," has her hand into this whole mess in the Ukraine. And we all know in 2014, I think the US spent like $5 billion in the regime change in Kiev. So perhaps you can tell our audience what exactly happened, or what do you think what people have to know about this regime change?
I think they should understand that there was a deliberate coup. Americans working closely with the Central Intelligence Agency, people like Nuland and others, systematically installed a new government composed of people that would do business with us. In other words, who would carry out our aims in the region, who were sufficiently anti-Russian, if you will. The Russians were unprepared for it. And I think this is, if I were going to offer some criticism of Putin, I'd say his greatest weakness was that he failed to appreciate just how malevolent, mendacious the American government was towards his government in Moscow. I don't think he understood what we were up to initially. When he found out, it was too late. And of course, he goes into Crimea in large part as a signal to us, don't try to push this any further, because if you do, you'll end up at war with us. He was quite convinced, and with good reason, that if he didn't do something about Crimea, Sebastopol would host NATO naval forces. And he's right. So I think it took him a while to figure this out. I think the same thing was true. You talked about the deal that was on the table in March. Again, I think he imputed more goodwill to us than was present. And some of that must have had to do with Trump, because, there were certainly people in his administration, unfortunately, who actively subverted President Trump and were always, I would say regime change oriented everywhere, not simply in Russia. But Donald Trump was not. And the last thing that Trump wanted was a war. In fact, he made that very clear in private. So I think that's part of the reason that he thought, well, perhaps there's a way through this. He found out the hard way there wasn't. And that's, in my judgment, also very damaging for Europeans, because there has always been a strong school on one side in Russia that is fundamentally, incurably anti-Western, that views the West as evil incarnate and something that Russia can never enjoy peace with. On the other hand, you have the Western school that says, no, 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 we are still part of Europe. We have interests in Europe, business interests, and we want to develop those. And that, of course, was Putin. And Putin was remarkable because he was probably, and I shouldn't say in past tense, but he is probably the one person who knows more about the West than almost anyone else who's ruled that country in the last, 100 years. So I think it was a terrible missed opportunity for everyone. And of course, Trump was not reelected, and the new regime coming in was, from the very beginning, always anxious to promote hostility to Moscow. And I saw this, by the way, when I was involved in the Kosovo air campaign, and I was the director of the Joint Operations Center. Very senior people on the American side told me, you don't understand, Douglas. We are starting a democratic revolution in Yugoslavia. We're going to sweep Milosevic and his friends out of Belgrade, and then the revolution is going to sweep all the way to Moscow. Now, imagine, this is December 1998 when I was told that. And I thought these people were deranged at the time, and I simply said, this is not going to happen. And if you try to do it, it's going to precipitate conflict that we don't really need and will not help Europe. But I was told I didn't understand. I didn't know what I was doing. So I shut up and went back to doing my job. But the point is, this was not a new phenomenon. This had germinated in the 90s. You've got to go back and understand this crazy notion that in 1992, in the aftermath of Desert Storm, we are unchallenged. We are the superpower of all time. We can now reshape the world as we see fit. When I say we, I'm not talking about the American people. Remember, the American people were never consulted. The American people, frankly, don't care. If you and I went to Kansas City, Missouri, and we started interviewing people at random off the street, I wager that more than half of them don't even know what NATO is. And the other half, when you start asking questions, they'll say, well, the problem we have right now is Mexico. It's an organized crime state. Millions of people are pouring into our country. This is a disaster. We need to protect our borders. That's what you're going to hear from Americans. Not, well, we don't care what happens in eastern Ukraine. Ask them where Kiev is. Ask them to show you on a map. Forget it.
They don't know it. Yeah, yeah. I definitely see a switch in the mood in the U.S. The people don't support the war against Ukraine anymore, and they have private problems, inflation, and so on. It's going through the roof. So in Germany, in Western Europe, the narrative in the mainstream media and from the politicians is still that Ukraine has to win the war, and they will win the war. But now we saw the counter-strike, which just failed. I think even the Washington Post wrote an article about that it's very hard for the Ukrainian army to win this war and that the counter-strike already failed. So have you been lied to in believing that Ukraine can eventually or actually win this war against Russia? And yeah.
Well, one of the things, and this is very important in my judgment for Germany, the army that was built in Ukraine was an army based on the World War II paradigm. In other words, it's a small replica of what people used 60, 70, 80, 90 years ago militarily, organizationally, equipment-wise, and so forth. Technology and the nature of society have changed dramatically since then. What the Ukrainians have been fighting, what we have been up against, backing them, is a very different military establishment that is organized, trained, and equipped for a different kind of warfare. And to understand this evolution, you've got to go back to the 1970s. Look at Marshal Ogarkov and his brain trust, which put together the notion of something called a recon strike platform. And the idea was that eventually all the space-based surveillance, overhead imaging capability, targeting capability would be linked to precision weapons on the planet that could then at will target and destroy whatever was necessary. This was the evolution away from the use of nuclear weapons because precision makes the nuclear weapon effectively irrelevant. The problem with nuclear weapons when they were devised and even now is that it's too destructive. There's no point in using them. You ruin the atmosphere, destroy the country or the force that you're trying to defeat. What you really want to do is find a way to bring the war to an end with minimal damage. You want to profit, if you will, from war, not destroy everything. This is why in this book that you mentioned in your introduction, I wrote called Transformation Under Fire was an attempt to come to terms with this on the Western side so that we could begin to look at warfare differently. It failed miserably because everyone's very comfortable living in the past. For your German audience, they need to think in terms of the old Prussian military establishment that marched out to Jena, Auerstedt to face the Grande Armée of Napoleon. They were utterly annihilated. Well, we Americans and our allies are stuck on the road to Jena, Auerstedt. We got to get off of it. Warfare has changed. So when the Germans started investing money in building the German military establishment, they need a new military establishment, not the old one. And if you go back to the interwar period, the problem that the Germans had in the 20s and the 30s was that they were only able to modernize a portion of the force, and they only reorganized a portion of the force. The vast majority of the Wehrmacht was still organized into these large infantry divisions left over from the First World War that lacked transport, firepower, mobility. And this hurt Germany badly during the war. Well, we are in the same boat now, all of us together. We've got to make profound changes all across the boards, and I don't know that anyone is prepared to do it yet. But we certainly don't have to wait to find out what the Ukrainians found out the hard way. That what we told them to do, how we organized them, how we equipped them, was the wrong answer.
Definitely. So what do you think when this war will end? Will it end next year?
I think that in the absence of any leadership from Europe, if no one steps forward from Europe independently of this thing you call the EU or NATO or anything else and says it's time for us to hold a conference, sit down with the Russians, and help the Ukrainians bring this to an end. If that does not happen, then I suspect Ukraine will eventually simply surrender. The Russians will move to whatever positions they think they need to occupy to protect themselves, and then they will wait.
Okay. What happens to Zelensky then if they surrender?
Well, I suspect a private plane will be sent to fetch him, and he'll fly off to Venice or Cyprus or Israel or somewhere else where he can live comfortably in one of his mansions. I suspect he'll probably want to go to Miami. That's my expectation. I mean, this whole thing rests on a mountain of corruption. The billions have been lost on this proposition.
Exactly. Even weapons, we don't know if they're on the black market, for example. We heard that some ISIS fighters already have some German tanks or something like that. But anyhow, we spent billions of dollars, and some of them even went perhaps to politicians or to Zelensky. And in this Time magazine article, the advisor of Zelensky already mentioned that that they are very corrupt and that the people take everything they can. A couple of days ago, there was one, I think it was a mayor. He had like $4 million in euro and in dollar. So where did this money come from? But anyhow, it's a corrupt country. It was corrupt, very much corrupt before the war. It's even more corrupt now. But we put so much energy into it, and now we are there with nothing in our hands. So what do you think? When will the people in the West wake up? And do you think that, because the attitude in the German press is, oh, if we don't stop Putin, he will come to Eastern Europe, he will invade Poland. You think this is realistic or is it delusional?
Well, that's just nonsense. It's never been true. It's less true now than it was before the war began. It's less true now because, first of all, there is no incentive to wage war on Europe. If you're a Russian, how do you profit from sustaining a war against Germany, France, or anybody else? You can't. It's a waste of time, money, and resources. If anything, the Russians want to get back to business. They want to return to some measure of normalcy. There's no interest in occupying anything. The other thing is, why would you want to occupy countries where everyone hates you? I mean, this is insane. I mean, do you think the Poles are going to roll over for the Russians? The Russians certainly don't. And they don't want to be bothered. You know, by the time the Warsaw Pact fell apart, most of what the Soviets regarded as their imperium, their empire, whether it was Cuba or Poland or any of those, these places were drains on Soviet resources, manpower. It was a losing proposition. Territorial imperialism was exactly what Bismarck warned. It was a huge waste of money. There was no return on the investment. It was all mortgaged to vanity. What a waste of time. It's unnecessary. So no, there's no danger of Russians marching west to do anything except get access to goods and automobiles and other things in Germany. They don't need weapons for that.
So there are rumors, and I also read something in the Washington Post that there are already that U.S. politicians and Europe politicians already forced the Zelensky regime to get in peace talks with Russia. Did you hear something about it? Do you think it's realistic that they really try to force them right now after 1.5 years of war and senseless war and millions, not millions, but 100,000 of deaths, that they really put them into the on the table for diplomatic ceasefire or freedom talks, peace talks?
The amount of money that we have to pay on an annual basis to service our sovereign national debt is now over $1 trillion. And $1 trillion is roughly the amount of money we spend on defense and the supporting intelligence agencies. So, of course, yes, you've got this insane regime under Biden that has bankrupted us even further, wasted our resources, revealed, in my judgment, through stupidity, that we are not invulnerable, invincible by any means. And so, yes, I think that you had Secretary of State Burns, certainly the director of CIA Burns, probably Blinken to some extent, certainly Austin in the Department of Defense, who said, look, we'll continue to support you, but it's time for you to find out what the Russians want and bring this to a close, because we can't support it anymore. It has no support publicly, and we simply can't afford it. Otherwise, unless something is done, you'll see a replay of Afghanistan. What did we do? We packed up, as I told you before about Vietnam, and left. And, remember people said, if you leave Vietnam, the communists in North Vietnam will march all the way across Southeast Asia. There'll be war for years. Nonsense. And what if we leave Iraq? The Iraqi parliament has already voted us out of the country. They did that in 2020. Had a vote and said, get out. We don't want you here. We still have over 5,000 troops in Iraq. Why? Because everything is mortgaged to vanity. We are concealing the true scale of our failure, of our strategic defeat. If you leave, people will say, oh, well, look, they left. It's a failure. That's the fear in Washington. But in truth, back to my original point, you tell the average American, well, we left Iraq. He'll say, I thought we did that a few years ago. He could care less. This is what people don't get. Even our politicians don't understand it. They say, well, how do I explain this in the next election? That we failed in Ukraine, we failed in Iraq, we failed in Afghanistan, we failed in Libya, and you just go down the list. It's not going to be a topic because the topic is back where we started. It's exactly what you enumerated. That's the topic that matters to Americans.
Yeah, talking about elections, what do you think? Who will win?
Well, first, I don't know how these elections will go. In other words, I'm not sure we'll get that far. There's an awful lot of discontent inside the United States with the way the last election was conducted in 2020. Your viewers may not understand this because you have across Germany fairly uniform conduct of elections. In other words, whether you're in Bavaria, North Rhine-Westphalia, whatever, it's uniform. It's not true in the United States. And this goes back to our Constitution, which everyone holds up as this holy relic, which can never change. The problem was in 1787 when they said, we've got to figure out how we're going to hold elections in the United States. They said, well, the federal government has no money. And until World War I, the federal government represented less than 2% of gross national product in the United States. America is a bottom-up country. That's how we grew. That's how we developed. We didn't have steering mechanisms in Washington at all, very little. And so they said, well, we'll have to give the power to the states because the states, the individual colonies, had plenty of money. They can afford to run the elections. That has stuck since 1787. In other words, when you go to Massachusetts, you go to West Virginia, you go to Portland, Washington, how they conduct their elections depends on the state government and whatever uniform regulations they have in that state. But they'll be different across the country. Well, if elections are different from state to state, how do you ensure anymore in a country of 330, 340 million that those elections are free and fair? It's a huge question. Now, let's assume that we march into the election in the fall of 2024. Are we going to see a different outcome from the one that we saw in 2020? We don't know because, again, the elections are not uniformly conducted. There are irregularities depending upon what county, what district, what precinct, what state you happen to be in. And I'll give you a quick example of my own personal experience. I remember this vividly because in 1960, which tells you how old I am, I was 7 years of age. My mother was a quote-unquote judge of elections. In other words, she had been elected in the precinct to run the electoral process. Our precinct was overwhelmingly Ukrainian and Polish, people that had come from Poland and Ukraine, their children. They were all violent anti-communists, as you can imagine. They voted overwhelmingly for Richard Nixon, not because they disliked Kennedy, but they didn't trust him. They saw Nixon as reliably anti-communist. Those results were presented, and those results meant nothing because the decision at the top of Philadelphia by the ruling Democratic Party was that Kennedy was going to win. And they turned in results saying that 90+% of all voters in Philadelphia voted for John F. Kennedy. So the election was a fraud in 1960. And I can tell you, having lived in that city for many years afterwards, they haven't had a clean election in that place for 50, 60 years. Now, what makes you think that's going to change between now and the fall of 2024?
Interesting. So I don't think Joe Biden is fit for office even now. So how will he be fit for office in fall 2024 or 2025?
Well, that's interesting you bring that up, because I didn't think he was fit for office when he held the Senate seat. So, I'm one of those people that thought, this is appalling. But we've got lots of people that are installed in these positions for decades. They have donors, people that keep them there. And right now, Washington is donor-occupied territory. In other words, everyone used to talk about corporations. It's not just corporations now. We have oligarchs, and they produce vast quantities of cash, and they can influence elections. It's a huge, huge problem. So again, when you ask about elections, I'm not sure. I just don't know.
We will see. So your take is perhaps there won't be any elections in fall.
I don't know. We'll have to see. I mean, if there are, I just don't know why anyone expects a better or a new outcome. That's the problem.
Yeah. So let's switch gears and talk about another war zone. Let's talk about Israel and Gaza. What's your take on this situation right now?
This is different from all of the previous wars that Israel has been involved in. The last major war was in 1973. And in October 1973, the Israelis were surprised by the swiftness and the effectiveness of the Egyptian attack across the Suez Canal, to the point where the Egyptians moved across the canal, set up a defense, and defeated the Israelis in their attempts to retake the ground in the Suez. In Syria, the Syrians broke through but were unable to organize themselves effectively, so the breakthroughs were stopped by a handful of very brave tank crews. And once the war in Syria turned in favor of the Israelis, they turned back to the Egyptian front. And then, of course, they managed to eventually penetrate, cross the canal. We intervened because we made it clear that we and the Soviets would not tolerate the destruction of the government in Cairo. And the rest is history. This is a very different set of circumstances. This time, the Israelis were surprised, and they were also horrified, because they saw this very barbarous, savage attack. But even more important, they saw this attack emanate from a place called Gaza that was effectively under lock and key. Or it's a large open-air prison from the standpoint of most Arabs that lived there. And the Israelis, I was just over there in 2020, and I visited the southern front facing Gaza, and I saw how the Israelis were organized. And I was shocked, because I thought the Israelis had a very clear grasp of what was happening every minute of every day on the ground in Gaza. Well, I guess I was wrong. And so the population was even more shocked at the failure of Israeli intelligence and military power to deal with this sudden and striking attack. I think those things embarrassed the Israelis, embarrassed their government, embarrassed their leadership, embarrassed the population, because they see themselves as very superior to the peoples that surround them, as better educated, more capable, better equipped, better trained, better informed, and so forth. So I think what you then saw happen was a vengeance campaign. We've got to go in there and demonstrate conclusively, not just to the people living in Gaza, but to everyone in the region, that if you do something like this to us, we will annihilate you. And you've always had large numbers of Israelis who have aspired to create this greater Israel, which is everything between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. They are now in charge. And they say, that's it. The only way we will be safe is to rid ourselves permanently of this population. So while there's lots of talk about destroying Hamas and rescuing hostages, the ultimate goal, I think, is to remove the population that is there. Because from their standpoint, if you say, well, that's unacceptable, they'll say, wait a minute, you want us to go after a school of fish in an ocean. And that school of fish is Hamas. but they swim in an ocean surrounded by large quantities of fish. So the only thing we can do to be certain is to drain the ocean. They're draining the ocean in Gaza. Now, I think that's very dangerous because I, unlike my Israeli colleagues, think that the region has changed dramatically. Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, these are not the same countries they were 50 years ago. They actually have populations that can read, write, think, understand, follow social media, and are capable of employing not just conventional weapons, but other things. They can manipulate internets, they can hack computers, and all these sorts of things. And then behind them stand two regional superpowers. One is Turkey, and the other is Iran. Now, the interesting thing is that Iran historically is not violently Israeli. I know people look at me and they think, well, that's strange. The Iranian government says X, Y, and Z, but the population there has never been overtly anti-Israeli. Frankly, lots of Iranians have about as much interest in what's happening there as the people in Kansas City do in what's happening in eastern Ukraine. But Iran wants to be a leader inside the Islamic world. It wants to assert itself, so it can't walk away from it. And of course, it has Hezbollah. The original intention behind Hezbollah was to build this up so that the people in southern Lebanon, the Shiites that lived there, would have nothing to fear from Israel. Well, Hezbollah is far beyond that stage. They can field thousands and tens of thousands of very competent fighters. They fought in the Syrian war, and they have precision-guided missiles and rockets. I mean, they can level a large part of Israel. So can Iran. Iran does not have an army capable of threatening Israel or a navy, but it has an enormous arsenal of precision weapons, rockets, unmanned systems, missiles. That could devastate Israel, all conventional. And they made the decision to go to the conventional warheads and build up this arsenal rather than beat themselves to death in pursuit of a nuclear weapon, contrary to popular belief. And then there is Turkey. The Turks are the most martial people in the region. Turks are ferocious soldiers. I've seen them. I've worked with them. They're competent. They're not stupid. And they can field an army of 2 million in the space of a month. They have a very effective reserve mobilization system. They have the largest fleet of unmanned systems, flying unmanned systems, aerial unmanned systems in the world. Some of them are new, some of them are not, but they can all do a lot of damage. They have a very formidable navy. And Mr. Erdogan aspires to be the de facto leader of the Muslim world. And he speaks in those terms, and his recent speeches were not just directed at Turkey, they were directed at the whole Islamic world, as well as to us, where he has said very categorically, we are no longer talking with Mr. Netanyahu. He is the leader of a crime state, a war criminal himself, and Israel is a war crime state. And at some point, and he's made this very clear, Turkish soldiers will fight in Gaza. Then he's gone a step further and he said, listen, Mr. Netanyahu, your nuclear weapons won't save you. Now, people say, well, how is that possible? And what people in the West are beginning to understand is that Turkey has always had access to nuclear warheads, if needed, from Pakistan. And in fact, members of Pakistan's parliament have stood up and said, it's time for us to help our brothers in Turkey, to provide them with the nuclear deterrent they need. And that ultimately is the key word. It's not as much about using a nuclear weapon as it is having one that deters your opponent, in this case, Israel, from using one. This is very dangerous. This is well beyond anything we've ever seen before in the region. And for the first time in probably 1,000 years, all of those Muslims are unified in their opposition to what's happening in Gaza. So my position is Israel's got to back off. And it has to find another way forward, because if it doesn't, it's on the path to a regional war that I do not think the Israelis can win. And of course, they're betting very heavily on us that we will somehow or another make up the deficit, compensate for whatever it is they don't have. Well, there are two problems with this. First of all, we're not living in 1991. The vast forces that we had at our disposal then don't exist now. We don't have an army to send. What we call an army is strewn out in small pieces across Eastern Europe. And I'll be frank with you, it's a shadow of what I served in. It's not very capable. And then you're talking about the Navy. Well, yes, we have several carrier battle groups, and they can do many things, but their ability to influence things ashore is limited. And then, of course, is the Air Force, which needs land-based facilities from which to fly. Now, perhaps the expectation is that the Italians, the Greeks, the Bulgars, and others will have no objections if we want to fly strikes in support of Israel. I'm not so sure. And then finally, there is the American electorate. My generation is very sensitive to the Holocaust. We saw that in the aftermath of the war. We all lived through that. The generation that is now moving into positions of influence and power and authority in the United States does not share that view. In fact, their view is something that happened 80 years ago does not give anyone the right to brutalize, punish, or mistreat collectively a group of people today. So it's a different set of circumstances. And for those reasons, I've tried to tell my Israeli colleagues who will listen, it's time to reconsider this course of action because it may not lead to what you want. And I warn them about us. They think that we're steadfast, but I've told you already, how do we ultimately behave when things don't go our way?
Is there a big influence or something like an Israel lobby in Washington, D.C.? Or why are there carriers in front of Israel and supporting the Netanyahu strategy?
Yeah, I would say that the people on the Hill are very, very responsive to donors. And enormous quantities of money have been spent over many, many years securing the loyalty of elected representatives in both the House and the Senate. As I said before, my generation, you didn't need to be on the receiving end of cash to be supportive. Today, I think it's necessary. I don't think the Israelis can take for granted that they're going to get all the support that they want. I think there are actual limits now. I don't know. I could be wrong. Perhaps I've misjudged it, and the Americans will merrily march off to war in support of Israel against the entire Muslim world. I don't think so. The other thing is, remember, we're very vulnerable, you, Europeans, Americans, to economic implications. What do you do if the Straits of Hormuz are shut? What do you do if you lose access to the Suez Canal? Vessels are already being rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope in the south to move in through the Mediterranean to reach Israel because they're worried that something could happen in the Suez. That's the tip of the iceberg. There are all sorts of other things that can happen. And then, of course, in the background stand Russia and China. And the Russians and the Chinese, in my judgment, will not stand idly by and allow Iran to be destroyed by us. And I think there are limits to what they're prepared to do, but I doubt seriously that they would allow Turkey to be destroyed either. Especially Russia would be acutely sensitive to that. So we don't know what they will do, but I think we can bet on some form of support that could come to the aid of people in the region against Israel. So peace is actually an appealing alternative if we can get somebody to buy into it. And you're not going to get a perfect outcome. You're not going to be able to satisfy everybody. But you've got to try to do something because the alternative looks like Armageddon.
Yeah, definitely. If this spreads, it will be horrible. It will be World War III, actually. But I can't still get my head around that Mossad, one of the most capable agencies in the world, didn't see it coming. How did it happen? Or even the Israeli army. I think they are well equipped and they are super informed. How could this surprise attack happen? Did it happen like we saw it on the telly?
I don't know. I think that part of it is that Israel has been very focused, and with good reason, on Hezbollah, because Hezbollah really is dangerous. I mean, if you provoke Hezbollah, they are capable of inflicting enormous damage. It would take the entire Israeli Defense Force, Air Force, all their capabilities to deal with Hezbollah. And so as a result, I think they have tended to view Gaza as less of an existential threat. And I think they underestimated what was going on over there. I don't think they interpreted events properly. There's a certain amount of arrogance and hubris involved.
Yeah, possible. So, what's your take on China? Is there any chance that China will use the situation of a declining hegemonic power of the US and invade Taiwan, or you think this is out of?
No, that's nonsense. China has serious internal problems right now. But it also, the problem is that we tend to project onto China European norms. In other words, we pretend as though the clock has stood still since 1910, that the powers will behave as they did then. China is the last country in the world that wants a war. China has now recovered from its century of humiliation, but it has a long way to go. They have enormous problems inside the country with corruption. I mean, they've had to jail people that were responsible for the shipyards, for building hulls that were fundamentally flawed. They have general officers that have been stealing whatever they possibly could get their hands on. Xi has done everything in his power to jail or sometimes execute these people. He's trying to do something, and that is he wants to feed, shelter, and protect his population. He's got 1.4 billion people. And I've been to Northeast Asia, and as I tell people all the time, when Xi wakes up every morning, he's not worried about the United States. He's worried about how do I hold 1.4 billion people together? And I think the Chinese population knows that. He also knows historically dynastic change in China results when the population can't eat or when the population is attacked and defeated. The Chinese military fails. So he's not looking for a fight by any means. And as far as Taiwan goes, and this is very exasperating because I deal with this all the time. First of all, if China were to attack Taiwan, it would destroy its relations with everybody in Asia. China wants to do business with everyone in Asia. China is competing economically, particularly in Southeast Asia and South Asia, with Japan. If it engages in that sort of thing, it loses immensely overnight. Secondly, Xi came to San Francisco, and I think he was very clear on the points concerning what China would and would not do, and he made it very clear. If Taiwan doesn't declare independence, we're not going to intervene because we have a schedule. We're looking at 2040, 2046 was the last one that I heard about for reunification. They also know that you have a system on Taiwan, different parties, and right now it's coalesced into two. The one that's been ruling, which is historically pro-Japanese, and the others who are historically pro-Beijing. Now, people think that this coalition of pro-Beijing parties is going to win, in which case they would vote themselves into the Chinese nation. Again, go back to Hong Kong. Look at what happened in Hong Kong. We had a very one-sided picture. My oldest son was in Hong Kong at the time watching everything. He kept calling me. He said, for every Chinese they show you on the television who is screaming freedom and democracy, there are 10 that say these people are idiots and need to be deported. But we never heard from them. Xi never intervened in Hong Kong. Everybody said, he's going to go in there. He's going to mass forces. No, this man is not Mao. That's not his purpose. He wants stability, predictability. He wants prosperity. So all of this about China needs to go away. We need to stop talking about it. You know how many nuclear-powered submarines the Chinese have? Well, the last count was 6. They may have lost one in the Sea of Japan, so they may be down to 5. This is not a nation that, in terms of maritime power, can really compete. China is historically not a maritime power. Japan is. And Japan is a serious superpower in waiting and never gets any credit for it. And we cannot militarize our relations with Asia anymore. In fact, we need to demilitarize them. They're really about doing business, not about making war.
Talking about military, do we have to expect more wars in the future?
Only if we continue to be as stupid as we are. Now, when I say we, I'm talking about the United States. America has this wonderful ability to stay out of things. I would argue the greatest single mistake that we made in our history was to intervene in the First World War. And the reason we did it is very simple. We had opened our credit markets to the British and the French. The British and the French were losing the war. The creditors came to Wilson and said, we're going to be bankrupt. Everything's going to fall apart if we don't win this war. We've got to go in and rescue the British and the French. Should never have done that. This was a war of great powers against other great powers, imperial powers against other imperial powers. Most Americans by 1910 were furious that we'd stayed in the Philippines. You recall we won the Spanish-American War. Then we made the decision to stay in the Philippines. Why? And we ended up killing 250,000 Filipinos who had fought for their freedom from the Spaniards and thought that we would simply liberate them and go home. I mean, this is, I can't even begin to tell you the insanity of the 20th century. And we're coming out of this, but we're not out of it yet. But I think that we have a good chance of escaping from it in the next decade, depending upon who ultimately rules the country. Back to your original question, I don't know what's going to happen, but I know that the American electorate, I think, has pretty much had it.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, same in Germany. But I asked this question because our defense secretary, Boris Pistorius, just said to the public of the German public that we have to get ready for war. So that's why I was shocked, because I never heard something like that in the last 10, 20, 30 years. So if our defense secretary prepares us for war, what is he planning to do? Because I think the German army is like a shadow of itself. And I think we spent everything for Ukraine. There is nothing left, no ammunition, no wars, no tanks, no Leopards. So what do you think is behind this speech he gave to the public in Germany?
It sounds as though he was handed talking points by Washington.
Okay, you think he's a puppet of Washington, and he has, like Boris Johnson...
Isn't everybody in Europe right now?
Yeah, we are. So how can we emancipate ourselves away from our big brother in the States?
Look, that's a question you have to answer. I think you need to go to the polls. At least you have elections that are cleaner and fairer than we do. You have a shot. But someone has to have the guts, the courage to stand up and say enough is enough. We Germans are going to chart our own course, and people will be horrified. You'll have my generations, oh, no, we can't do that. That's dangerous. That's nonsense, and I think what they have to do is decide where do they want to fit in? How do they want to fit in? Doesn't mean that you're going to have hostile relationships with anybody. There's no real reason for it today. But you've got to take control of your own destiny. That's the problem. And I think you must. And I welcome any attempt by the Germans to do that. And I had this conversation privately before I was finished in my short time in the last administration. And depending upon who is elected, you could have a very receptive audience to that. Because I think, again, this is a different generation. People are well beyond the Second World War. And we need to be.
Yeah, definitely. Colonel Macgregor, it was a pleasure talking to you, and it was so much insights and interesting talking points. So thank you very much for your appearance and for the first time on a German channel. And I would love to talk to you again. But please tell our audience where they can find more about you or follow you.
Well, I've just become the chief executive officer for something called Our Country, Our Choice. So if you go to that on the internet, ourcountryourchoice.com, just write it as one word. This is a group of people. I was not a founding member. They asked me to come in, and I've done it. But this is a group of people that said, we're tired of going to the polls, and it doesn't make any difference who you vote for. You get the same bad policies. So they said, we want a third way. We want an end to these overseas interventions that have done us no good, are a complete waste of time and money, and simply cultivate more enemies. That's number one. Number two, we want to defend our own borders. We want to close this border inside our country. We want to restore the rule of law. We want it enforced, an end to the criminality that is spreading all over our large cities and now into the rural areas. In other words, we want teeth in law enforcement. We want to expel the illegals. We want to crack down on the drug cartels. But we want to do these things at home. Then beyond that, we want to stop the sexualization of our children, which we absolutely abhor that is happening with this current government. And there are other things. I mean, they're all very domestically oriented. And we think we've already had a lot of inquiries from people in Sweden, the French, some in Italy, a lot from India, So it's very interesting. You find as you look around the world, a lot of people have the same views that we all have a great deal of work to do inside our countries, inside our own societies, and that we have to stop this business of destroying our own culture, our own identity, our own way of life on the assumption that somehow or another everything that happened before we came along was wrong. Absolutely not. It needs to stop. That doesn't mean that we think we're perfect. It doesn't mean that we don't admit to mistakes. But on the whole, we haven't done badly. And of course, this was the message I was trying to send to the Germans. This obsession with this short period of history. And it needs to end. Not be forgotten. Of course not. You don't want to forget anything. But you need to have a broader perspective on the historical stage and stop apologizing.
Definitely. I wasn't even alive when this happened. So, yeah, I agree.
Right.
I agree with you 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, my best to you, and thanks for inviting me, and God bless everybody in Germany.
Thank you very much. And next time we do it in German, I would love to invite you again, of course.
Das wäre gefährlich. Mein
Wow.
Gott. Dieses Risiko gehe ich überhaupt nicht ein. Forget it.
Oh, it's
Okay.
marvelous. Thank you very much for your time. Take care and
Auf Wiedersehen.
see you soon. Bye.